It's time for another Dirt Daily. Today I am in the shop working on the Summer Camp Jeep. Summer Camp Jeep is a Jeep that we built 2015, and it has been out on the trail a bunch. It's seen a bunch of different action, but recently it's been sitting, growing cobwebs, and so I am going through it, trying to fix some things that it needs so that it can go on another big adventure. Today's project is the front axle. I was just going to swap tires on the front axle, and then I found a few little issues, so today we're going to dive into the front end. Nothing major, just minor service stuff, but little things that have gotten worn in, worn out, and we have to fix them, rebuild them, or replace them. So let's dive right into this. The front axle on the Summer Camp Jeep is a Spidertrax 9-inch. It's the Spider 9, which is basically a hot rodded version of the old Ford 9-inch. It has a dropout third member. The front third member on this Jeep is from Gearworks. It's a high pinion 10-inch ring gear. So it has a high pinion, which means the drive shaft is up high, has a 10-inch ring gear, which is bigger than a Dana 60, bigger than a 9-inch, bigger than a Dana 60. Not as big as a 14 bolt, but still pretty massive for strength. And it has the pinion up high, which is great because it keeps the drive shaft up out of rocks. Now, the 9-inch style differential does use a pretty small locker compared to like a Dana 60. It's just overall smaller, but this has a Gearworks locker in the front. I haven't had any issues with that. And in the rear, it used to have a spool, and I pulled that out and replaced it with an ARB selectable locker, which makes it much more fun for street driving as well as trail driving because I can lock it and unlock it. And then this has 35 spline axle shafts from the inside and outside. And instead of using a spindle and a rebuildable hub, this uses Spidertrax Ultimate unit bearing, which I have found to be a great upgrade. Very few issues with that. So today we have to take off the tires, take out the unit bearing, take out the brakes, and dive into the front axle shaft because there's a little bit of slop in the U-joints. Let's go check it out. So this is the front U-joint on the driver's front corner. And if you zoom in right down in there, you can see there's a little crack. It's not a crack as much as you can see a split in the dirt and the dust. And the fact that it gets wider and narrower is not good. But luckily, these are CTM U-joints and they are rebuildable. In order to get them out, though, we have to disassemble the front axle. So in order to take the axle shafts out, you want to drain the oil out of the diff. My first thought was maybe I can get lucky and I can remove this fill plug right here on the Spidertrax housing and reach in there with like a siphon and try to like suck the gear oil out, and then I don't have to pull the whole housing apart. However, when I looked inside there, I found a little problem. So I removed the fill plug right here, and then I zoomed down in there with a flashlight, and I think you can probably just make it out that is the seal for the axle shaft. And that seal is separated. So I have a torn axle seal on the inside here. Now, the way this axle housing is set up, there's multiple seals. There's like 2 seals in a seal carrier that presses into the tube. And because I'm not seeing oil just pouring out the knuckle, that tells me the seal is still good. But then it tells me only one of the seals is still good because the other one is obviously torn. So that tells me I got to tear it all apart. Not completely, but I mean I need to pull the tires off, pull the unit bearings off, pull the axle shafts out, rebuild both U-joints on both sides, and also pull the drive shaft out, pull the third member out, and replace the seals. But that's kind of how front axles are. Like if you've ever had an off-road vehicle with a front axle, eventually you'll see some gear oil coming out into your knuckles, and that's because that inner axle seal has failed. It happens all the time. It's not an easy, fun project. It's kind of a big mess, but it's something you're gonna have to do. This axle is different than most OEM style axles because it's a fully fabricated axle, but it does have the same premise of an inner axle seal. So let's take the tires off, blow these knuckles apart, get these axles out, and get to fixing this thing. So this is the high pinion third member from Gearworks. Has a high pinion 10-inch, but I need to remove this drive shaft and then remove these bolts in order to remove this to get all the oil out to change those oil seals. But I also need to remove the axle shafts before I can even pull the third member out. So I'm gonna start by removing the drive shaft, just kind of zip tie it up out of the way. The axle's suspended by these limit straps, so it's not going anywhere. I also have a big screw jack under the front of the Jeep, so everything's pretty safe. So we're gonna start with drive shaft, and then we'll move out to the knuckles, take those apart, pull the axle shafts out, and then we can pull the third member. Clean up all the oil mess, and then start the reassembly and rebuild. At the bottom of the third member here are 3 bolts. And I think that if I take these out, yes, the gear oil will leak out. Now, the reason that's good is because that means it won't leak down into the axle tube. It's funny that I didn't think to do that before, because that would have drained the oil out and I would have been able to pull the axle shafts out. But if I would have done that, I would not have noticed that the inner axle seal was kind of tearing apart. All right, let's dive into this front knuckle. Just like anything, you're gonna wanna remove the brake caliper first. Keep track of all your hardware. You will pry this off of here. There we go. These are Willwood calipers. And then this Spidertrax rotor hat you can remove, or you might be able to just leave that all together and take it off with the unit bearing. I'll hit it with a little bit of penetrating oil and see if it'll just pop off. There we go. Just like that, comes right off. Once the rotor is off, we can come in here and remove these little Allen bolts, these little tiny guys. Be sure and drop them on the floor. We can undo these. And what those allow us to do is remove this cap. And under that cap, there is an O-ring seal. There's also some grease. Once you get that cap off, there is a snap ring in the end of the axle. Let's see if I can find the end of it here. There it is. And you just come in with a pick. You get that little snap ring started, and it'll just unwind from the groove in the axle shaft. And then there's a little spacer behind that, little rubber gasket, O-ring. Drop all that into the cap. And then the next step is to remove the unit bearing. If you look right down here, you can just see the threads of a bolt that bolt through the inside of the knuckle into the unit bearing. And to get to that, I've found that a 12mm socket with a piece of a giant 12mm Allen wrench is the perfect way to get inside there to those bolts. You're going to want to spray the threads of these bolts down. These 4 bolts that hold the unit bearing onto the knuckle are basically what holds everything together. So when those go together, they are very tight. The heck is the flashlight? What is wrong with me? These guys. I used to not be a huge fan of unit bearings because the unit bearing basically, on an old 4-wheel drive axle, there would be a spindle and then the hub would slide on and that would have bearings in it and you could rebuild it and it was all great, but it was also a big greasy mess. And then some friends of mine up in South Dakota were rock crawlers, competition rock crawlers, had a little shop called Twisted Customs. And they started using these Spidertrax unit bearings and they were like, oh, they're so good. And I was like, how can they be good? And they're like, well, you can rebuild the whole front axle by just removing these 4 bolts and popping the unit bearing out. And then when you do that, you can get into the axle shaft without making a giant greasy mess. And I was like, that sounds good. And then there it is. Now a lot of late model full-size trucks run a unit bearing. In fact, even I think half-size smaller trucks. But the Spidertrax version has some heat-treated chromoly parts in it, beefier stuff that they have had really very few failures in the competition rock crawling scene. And it also ends up in a lot of the King of the Hammers style vehicles run this ultimate unit bearing. Now, mine is 35 spline. Nowadays, those guys are all running 40 spline, bigger, beefier, badder dude stuff. But now I can slide this axle out. Oh, I might need to take the little caps out of the U-joint. At least one of them. You still do get greasy. I think it's impossible to work on an axle without getting greasy, especially one that's been wheeled for a bit. But most of this grease is just grease that was applied to the splines so that it would all go together easily. So, okay. Remove 2 U-joint caps. Will that be enough? Yes. There is our axle shaft. I can hear a little bit of clicking. There's a little bit of slop in those joints. Those are CTM joints, 300M, super beefcake stuff, but they do need rebuilt every now and then, especially when the front end is always spinning. And when you use a ultimate unit bearing, that is one thing you don't have the option of, is to unlock the front hubs. So this has to go on the bench and get torn apart. I pulled the third member out, being careful not to damage the gasket, and now you can see inside here the seal that has torn. This is what the seal should look like. This machined aluminum piece has O-rings to seal into the axle tube, and then there are two Seal-It seals that the axle shaft runs through. The way it's set up on this front axle, one of those inner seals is torn. The other one is okay, but it has also allowed the short side axle tube to fill up with gear oil. So I think my plan is to remove the little set screw that slides into this locking notch, and then try to get the whole seal housing removed to either rebuild it or replace it with another one that's already assembled. This little set screw backs out. However, I'm pretty sure that the seal housing has been siliconed into the tube because I can feel a bunch of silicone around the edge. So it's going to take a little bit of force to knock that out and into the housing. If you look inside the axle here, there's actually a seal at the outside of the axle tubes. So that small seal in there seals the outside of the axle tube, which just helps keeping water and mud from getting into the axle tube and then past the other inner seals to the differential. It's kind of like a third layer of protection. Two seals on the inside, a single seal on the outside. Unfortunately, on the driver's side, I had to destroy the seal to remove it, and this was damaged when I was knocking that seal housing out of the housing. So all of the seals on the driver's side of the axle housing need replaced. The ones on the passenger side look pretty good. So hopefully I can just clean everything on the long side of the housing, double check all the seals that they're not torn or warped or anything messed up. And then this side should be able to go back together. It's just the ones on that side that are going to take a little bit of work. I have to clean all that silicone residue out of the housing where the seal carrier was, and then figure out if I can rebuild the seal carrier that was in there, or if I'm going to replace it with another one that I have on the shelf. That's it for this Dirt Daily. We'll see you guys next time.